Hey everybody, just wanted to say thank you for your flexibility this week. Sorry we were not able to meet in person, just trying to be cautious. I have not gotten the test results back yet at the time of this recording, so I likely don't have COVID, but they say keep people away. So again, sorry to not see all of you, but hopefully this talk that I'll be giving in video form will still be helpful to you and connect you with God a little bit. I'm going to look today at the fourth chapter of the book of Jonah, and just some of the kind of lessons there. So this week, when I was looking at Jonah, I was realizing, of course, it's a pretty wild book, and we'll get into the story in a second here. But there's a lot of different ways to approach the book of Jonah, and one particularly intriguing way of approaching it that I ran into this week was through the genre of farce. The genre of farce is a comedic genre. The idea is you exaggerate things slightly, you focus on less important details for the sake of bringing out what is actually important, what is actually big in a story. So I don't think that means necessarily that the events in this book are untrue, because that is not my belief. But I think the way things are emphasized in this book are done so a little bit to make people, specifically Jonah himself, look a little bit ridiculous. And I think that there's a real lesson that is trying to be learned in there. So we don't use farce a ton in our modern culture, but I did think of the book, I'm sorry, the newspaper The Onion, which, if you're not familiar with them, they make kind of mock news stories about current events. And I think that kind of gets the idea of they kind of tell a joke that is drawing out a real world problem. So thought I'll start out by reading just a couple of my favorite headlines from The Onion to get us in the spirit of Jonah. The world death rate holding steady at 100%. The CIA realizes it's been using black highlighters all these years. Kitten thinks of nothing but murder all day. Winner didn't even know it was a pie eating contest. And I guess to keep us in the religious spirit, God answers prayer of a paralyzed little boy. No, God says. So again, the idea there is poking fun at real world trouble, real world difficulties, but using humor to highlight important things, as we're going to see in Jonah as well. So review the story of where we're at up until this point. Jonah is told to go talk to Nineveh, big bad Nineveh, the national enemies, genocidal maniacs. They were not nice people. Jonah says, I'm good, God, and he hops on a boat, goes the opposite direction. God sends a storm after him. The sailors on the boat figure out that it's his fault, and so he recommends just having them throw him into the ocean, after which they worship God. They, like many of the other, filthy pagans in this story, tend to be a lot more receptive to what God is doing in life than Jonah does. So he goes over, he gets swallowed by a big fish, which is, of course, what this story is most famous for. He spends a couple of days in the stomach of that fish. And the second chapter of Jonah is a psalm that he writes in thankfulness that God has saved his life in a very unusual way. And though, as we'll see as we continue to read, the fact that his life has been saved doesn't seem to penetrate his heart and his way of thinking about God. The third chapter is he gets puked up on land. Jonah does, in fact, head into town of Nineveh and does a very bare minimum tour of preaching. Not his heart is obviously still not in it, but he says, "Hey, doom and gloom, you guys are going to die if you don't change your hearts and lives," and then marches back out. But surprise, surprise, the people were living in chaos at the time, and they respond. They say, "Yes, we do need to change. We change our hearts and our lives," and it's another of those kind of farcical, ridiculous scenes. They even make their animals follow the rituals of mourning, of saying sorry. They put them in sackcloth and put ashes on even their animals. And so that's where the story is up until this point. So Jonah, of course, should be happy that God has saved his life, that he's continued to tolerate his bad attitude, and that, hey, he's probably one of the most successful prophets of his day. He's having a much better time than some of his contemporaries. And so we'll start reading in Jonah chapter 4. And we'll see that that is, in fact, not how um, Jonah reacts to it. And I think this section I'm going to read is important because while the being swallowed by a fish is what this book is most famous for, this is actually the crux of the chapter. This is probably the most important thing we are meant to learn from this book. So at the end of chapter 3, it tells us, but the fact they responded well seemed bad to Jonah, a very bad thing. He was enraged. So he prayed to God, "Oh God, isn't this what I said when I was in my own country? That's why I acted previously by fleeing to Tarshish, because I know you're a God of gracious, compassionate, long-tempered, vast in commitment and relenting about something bad. So now, God, take my life from me. It's better my dying will be good, better than my living." And God said, "Is your rage good?" Jonah went out from town and sat east of town. He made a bivouac for himself there and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen to the town. God provided a quinyon vine, and it grew up over Jonah so as to be shade for his head and to rescue him from what was bad for him. Jonah rejoiced greatly about the quinyon. But God provided a worm when dawn came the next day and struck down the quinyon. It withered. And when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind. The sun struck down on Jonah's head. He grew faint and asked for his life again, that he might die. He said, "My dying will be good, better than my living." And God said to Jonah, "Is your rage good about the quinyon?" And he said, "It was good, my rage, to the point of death." And God said, "You pitied the quinyon, for which you didn't labor, for which you didn't grow, which came into existence overnight and perished overnight. Shouldn't I pity that great town of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 human beings who don't know their right hand from their left, as well as many animals?" So we're left with a question, which we'll get back to, but I think we don't actually know if Jonah learned his lesson or not, and I think that's going to be an important piece of it. So I wanted to start out just with kind of a quick comment on Jonah's rage. It says several times he was enraged, he was angry, he's just beside himself with anger at the way that this thing worked out. And I wanted to, just being someone who's pretty familiar with anger and rage, I just wanted to throw out a few of my own thoughts on this and his attitude and what it says about him. So first off, anger is not inherently bad, despite what you may sometimes hear in churches. God's anger itself is tied to justice. It's tied to the covenant relationship. It's tied to people not behaving in the ways they're supposed to. God gets angry a decent amount in the Bible, as well he should. There's a lot wrong in the world, a lot of people who are supposed to be getting it and treating people differently than they do, treat people very poorly. And so for God's anger in the Bible, it's almost always related to expectations around covenants and relationships, and it's always almost always based on justice. And so, yeah, I think it is okay to be angry about the way things are in the world. But psychologically, anger is usually kind of a fight or flight thing. Usually when we feel that we don't get what we want or something is wrong, whether it's with us or something else, it kind of flares up. It's a fight or flight kind of a thing. But it's usually pretty short. It bursts up and then it goes back down. And yet we also have the ability, I think, to practice at keeping anger around longer. I think we can nurse grudges. I think we can hold on to our anger. And I think a very common thing nowadays is people have almost a reservoir deep down inside. It's almost the undercurrent of who they are. And I think that's what's being talked about when he talks about rage. And I think that's part of what's going on with Jonah right now. The specific event is bothering him, absolutely. But I think it's been building for a long time. I think it's sitting in there, and he's able to draw from this deep reservoir of rage that is down below him. And I think that's one of the big things we've got going on in American politics right now, and just America in general with culture wars, etc. Is I think people are nursing and holding on to anger in a way they would never face to face in a person. I think it takes practice to hold on to the rage that is being used out there. And I just think it's a very careful warning from this story. I don't think it's the main point, but just something that I think we need to be careful of, because I don't believe anger can be held in the kind of static state it's in for long periods of time. I think it has to be nursed, it has to be held. And again, anger is not inherently bad. It can be very useful, and there is a lot in the world we need to be angry about. But nursing that rage is something that I think is very dangerous. And we see it right here in this story. I mean, you want proof of the fact that nursing and holding on to rage can be dangerous. What's the first thing Jonah says when he's angry? He's mad at God, and he throws some of the one of the most beautiful and important passages about how God is back in his face. He says, "Look, I ran away because I know who you are. You're a God that's gracious and compassionate and long-tempered and vast in commitment and relenting about bad things." Right? Those are wonderful traits. We would much rather God be that way than a lot of the kind of stereotypes people have of God. God says he is compassionate and merciful and kind and good. And rage has turned Jonah's view of those things that they are bad. He's taking something that's very good and very helpful, and he's spitting it back in God's face, which alone shows a lot of audacity for a person who this is what he does for a living, right? He is a prophet of God. He has a very unique and special calling, and he's spitting God's character back in his face. I just think it warns us how dangerous rage can be. And so I think the other question we have to ask ourselves is, why is Jonah so pissed in this story? What is he so mad about? And I think that he's feeling righteous in a lot of ways. And I think we want to talk about something that lets us nurse rage for a long time is when we feel like we are righteous, when we feel like we are right, is one of the best ways to do it. When we have been wronged, when we are in the right and everyone else isn't getting it, is one of the best ways to nurture rage and to continue to draw on that and to continue to feed on that. And I think that is what Jonah is drawing on. He's a prophet, right? He lived during the great age of prophecy in some ways. He is a contemporary of Isaiah. He's a contemporary of Amos, both of which had very different approaches, but were utterly brilliant. And they were both called to pretty thankless jobs. They worked on a pretty spiritually deaf community of the Israelites, the people who are supposed to get it, right? Jonah, on the other hand, gets sent to people he doesn't want to. And I can't help but wonder if he's not mad at God, that God isn't putting his priorities in the right places. Hey, your people are stubborn and not getting it. Maybe we should put our energy into them, not these, filthy pagans who apparently do get it. But that's just because you have too low of standards, right? I think Jonah actually feels like he's in the right in that these people deserve to die. And a piece of that is, I think, just his ethnic claims. He doesn't like these people because they're not him. I think a piece of it is we don't want to make light of who these people are, even though this is a farce and they're acting very silly. The Ninevites are, kind of classic bad guys from the ancient world. They were monsters. There's no, they were incredibly brutal. The way they treated people that they fought and captured, there was nothing like it. They were monsters, as much as people can be in any sense of the word. And so I think that Jonah is able to spit God's character back in his face because he thinks he's right and that God is wrong, right? These people don't deserve your attention. Your own people who aren't getting it do. Why are you doing this wrong? And I think God is showing Jonah a way out, a way to be free of this, with this weird little parable about the plant. And I think whereas there's nothing that diffuses this kind of like righteous rage that Jonah is hanging on to, so much is recognizing what it actually is. And I think God does this little thing to show him that he's got some self-investment in the way things are. Like he likes to think of himself, I'm pitying this poor plant that something bad happened to. I'm totally right in the way it is. But I think God is showing Jonah that his enjoyment of the plant, the fact he enjoys it and is benefiting from it, jeopardizes the legitimacy of his righteous complaint. He says that you pity this plant, but you didn't work for it. You didn't invest in it in any way, shape, or form. You just enjoyed it. And I think that's a really important hint, because I think especially around the ideas of righteousness, your ideas around pity, and and justice and those things, I think God is hinting that you can't actually enjoy those things unless you've worked at it. You have to have some investment in it. And Jonah doesn't. This plant is only beloved to him because it gives him comfort, because it gives him convenience. And I think the other implication is if God is showing mercy and pity to the Ninevites, he has in fact done that. Whereas Jonah just sat back and enjoyed the plant, God is invested with these human beings. He recognizes they don't know their right from their left. These are people that are just utterly lost. I mean, which you can even see in how silly their response is to God, to Jonah's, really terrible preaching to them is they humble themselves, they put on sackcloth and ashes. Again, they even make their animals and children and slaves do this because they don't really know how to relate to God very well. And God recognizes what their heart is at because he knows them, because he has been investing in them, even though they are monsters. They don't know their right from their left. They're utterly morally lost. But he's invested in them. He knows them. He sees. He's able to know them. And I think he's calling Jonah on that, saying, look, you are acting like you're so righteous and that you know these things, but you didn't invest anything in this plant. Whereas I have invested in these people. And so shouldn't you have a very different heart? And so I think that question is really important. He says, shouldn't I pity the great town of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 human beings who don't know their right hand from their left? And even many animals. The animals, I think, is a neat hint as well, because Jonah wouldn't have thought twice about them. They are just something to be used. They're a resource, which is often how we approach animals, which is often how we approach the natural world nowadays. And yet God cares about the least. And so I think there's a really important lesson in here for us to challenge ourselves and say, okay, when we feel so smug, when we have been chewing on something and feeling righteous, and we are building up rage over the way things are, can we honestly say that what we're so mad about isn't just something that benefits us? We like things the way they are. We like things safe and comfortable a lot of the time. And when we are willing to turn our anger on someone else and say they are unworthy, have we done the investment God has? He knows them. He has invested in working with them in the judgment, and he values things. We also have a bad tendency of saying, okay, these things are bad, they're monsters, they're not worth it, or they're too small, right? It's just dumb animals. It's just dumb things. And God never says that. He values the small things. He values the least. And so I think in a time when we have immense amounts of rage ourselves at the way things are, the way the world is running, we feel frustrated, we feel cheated. I think that Jonah is left with a question because we are supposed to ask ourselves that. I think the farce, the joke of this story is if we are not careful, we discover that we in fact are Jonah. We are nursing wounds, we are nursing regrets that may not be ours to do. We may be saying who's in, who's out, who's good, who's bad, what is valuable and what isn't. And only God has the right to say those things. And so I think we, like Jonah in this story, need to be challenged at times, saying, shouldn't I pity? Shouldn't I pity? Shouldn't I show mercy? Shouldn't I show greatness? And I think the question for us is our heart in the same place God's is? Or are we, like Jonah, willing to think we're so right? Willing to say who's in, who's out, who is valuable and who isn't, what is valuable and what isn't? Checking our own, whether it's ethnic or feeling smug, our own ways of being right and wrong, do they line up with God's, which tend to be pretty merciful and kind and caring about the least of these? So if you haven't read this story in a while, I'd recommend it. You can read it in one sitting pretty easily. Jonah, chapter 4. And again, put yourself in Jonah's shoes, because God doesn't want us to nurture that type of smugness. He doesn't want us to nurture rage. He wants us to be free of those things, to have big, generous heart the way he seems to, because he wants us to be free. Thanks.